Hopefully everyone can see my screen now. Great, thumbs up. Okay, welcome everybody. Apologies for needing to have rescheduled this community call in the first instance. It was due to have been, I think, a couple of weeks ago, but we had quite a bit of illness on our side, so thanks for allowing us to reschedule. Thankfully, everybody firing on all cylinders now. It's been just over a couple of months since our last community call. Things being slightly quieter over the summer with holidays, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, variously over that time. So it's, as we were just saying before the call, it might be today that other folks are taking a holiday with Labor Day in the US and stuff. So look forward to those catching up afterwards with the recording who aren't able to be here live today. So the regular plan for today is to go through sort of updates from the project side, talk a bit about any points along the way that people want to bring up, and then leave plenty of time for open Q&A at the end. So I think we're going to start with Marcel on release updates. Marcel, over to you.
Yes, so actually you might have noticed v0.6 has been out, so there is maybe some regressions that were not fixed in there deliberately that we know will be fixed in 0.7, but we try to address as many as possible. And as another reminder, if you want to ensure that your code stays compatible, use Unity. Danny will talk about more of that later. So the focus for 0.7 is still the performance issues and the new evaluator. So there are some things that were quite complicated to achieve there, but since recently this is moving quite quickly. I'll tell more about it in a new slide. So depending on how fast it goes, we might address certain issues in 0.6 or not, but we've already seen some bugs that people found that we already know are fixed in 0.7, even new bugs. So that's also a good sign for 0.7. So it looks like this is still the plan. So as a reminder, 0.7 will basically be a redo of how evaluation works. Disjunction will be rewritten from scratch, basically, because it's very broken at the moment. And also the closeness algorithm, there's been some rewrites in the past, but this one is one that can actually be comprehended by humans. So that's nice. And it's very local, only one level. So it's quite a much simpler closeness algorithm. And the biggest advantage of that algorithm actually is that it can detect failures very early, whereas before you needed to compute everything before to detect it, which allows you to prune disjunctions much sooner. So that ties in with performance also a lot. So then after that, again, like we may change the order of this a little bit, but so far it looks still like 0.7 will focus on performance and correctness. But then after that, 0.8 will focus on some of the backwards incompatible changes that we're planning for before v1. So for example, that lists are open by default, just like structs, making it consistent with structs has a lot of advantages. The closed built-in would then work exactly on lists as it would in structs. And then definitions are now allowed in closed structs, and then they would not be, which they really shouldn't be from a software engineering perspective. But that's a hard one to change. But we want to, like build some tooling around that to make sure that people can have a smooth transition there. Next slide. Yeah, so for the new evaluator, as I said, like the new closeness algorithm has been implemented and submitted. It's very technical how it differs. It's the same principle as the old one, but it's much cleaner and allows us to detect errors much more quickly. So the evaluator, we had the new evaluator, the old new evaluator, and the new evaluator, as I call it. So this is mostly inspired by the old new evaluator, but there's a new rewrite, and just as we have like the logic that detects structural cycles that was factored out from the code, we now also have reference cycles factored out from the code, which ultimately we're now still reusing the old code. This new approach allows reusing the old code much more, but Ultimately, it will allow changing the expression evaluation code to not have to handle cycles at all, because it will be handled in a separate layer, which is sort of like really looks like a scheduler, like an actual scheduler. And it's so this architecture allows us to play around with order of evaluation in a much more flexible way and more principled way. Much easier to deal with these situations. So should reduce the code base quite a bit and make it more principled, more sort of data-driven, state-based.
Also, just to jump in quickly, when people see new evaluator there, they might think, goodness me, new evaluator, we're chucking everything out. But this is really leaning on our learnings and the experience from what we're now calling the old evaluator to come up with.
Yeah, so basically whenever we say, it's very much like a new closeness algorithm. So we have like one algorithm, one part of the full evaluator that we're replacing. So this is the same thing here. It's actually not a lot of code, but it's one of the more complicated parts where we just take that and then replace it. And really it even reuses a lot of the old code, right? Like we try to make it as incremental as possible, but it is, in this case, it's a bit of a step change, just like we did with the new closeness algorithm and with the old structural cycle detection in the past. Roger?
And perhaps you could mention that you're planning to make it possible to run them both at the same time for the transition phase, which I think is important.
Yes. Yeah. The new implementation. So we're trying to reuse the old code and the new code at the same time. So the old evaluator will stay working, and the way it's done in the unit test, for example, there's the same test set which is used for both the old and the new evaluator, with a possibility to deviate in the output, right? Like if the new evaluator fixes a bug, we want it, we don't want it to break the old evaluator when we change it. So it's really like we're always comparing it in, at the same time, and we can easily switch back and forth between the old and new evaluator quite easily. So that's that's pretty neat. And basically the way it's working right now is it detects when features are not implemented yet in a new evaluator, and that sort of gates the test set. And then we're removing these gates more and more until they're gone, and then you would have a evaluator that is compatible with the old one, minus bugs. Tony?
Yeah, quick question, and maybe you're about to talk about this because there's different strategies possible for disjunctions, and then you're saying you could run the old and new evaluator. I could imagine there being like, you have some knobs there, and maybe that there's different strategies that might be working well for different classes of Q values that are written certain ways. And like, will we be able to have access to some of those knobs? Maybe not soon, but like, is that something that's being planned for?
I haven't thought about whether you would want to do that. I mean, I could imagine that in like a, just if you have Go debug, like a Q debug thing where you can maybe tweak some of these things. I could very well imagine that, but
I was thinking more like you're like disjunction heavy versus comprehension heavy. Maybe there's like different strategies of like, if you're going to be able to like sort of prioritize or like play with the order of evaluation, maybe there's like different knobs we can have there. It's just like throwing an idea out there.
That makes sense. So maybe the one thing that this looks, one thing that this evaluator does right now, because it does do the cycle detection and notification system, like blocking states and all that quite efficiently. It now, so I'm not even talking about disjunction, but just a normal evaluation. It does much less duplicate work compared to what it did before. And this will not be for 0.7, but for example, there's a different variation of this scheduling or like a layer on top implementation using a coroutine like implementation where you basically would not do any duplicate work at all. So then you basically know, like, it's just not possible to make it more efficient than that, right? Like more the minus constant overhead or modulo constant overhead. So disjunctions is a bit of a different beast. So even there we see that in most common cases, the vast majority, you can use like either discriminator fields, or if you have constants, or like with protobuf, right? Like you have discriminator arcs basically. So it's also a field, but different kind of field, where you basically can make it run in very predictably in constant time, right? Like you know which disjunction you would have to unify in order to proceed. So there's really a bunch of strategies that probably will work for everybody, but yeah, I can imagine that there are certain control flows where we would say.
I have asked just to plug the idea in your head so that maybe it's a possibility in the future.
Yeah, it could be. Sorry.
One more question. You're mentioning there's a new cycle detector. Does it lend itself towards like the possibility of bounded recursion? Where it's not general recursion, but I think you've talked about this before where, you know, there's a lot of things that would be a lot easier if we had like recursion, but like that's not like generally possible, but
yeah. So this is reference cycles, right? So recursion is structural cycles. So does not affect
different cycle detection.
Yeah. So really, I always said these two are two different cycles, but now in the implementation, you really see them very strictly separated. So like they're. So this is really references that basically go back, a value references itself rather than you copy structure that keeps being copied recursively, right? So that's sort of quite a different thing. Yeah, the biggest unknown from a time perspective is disjunctions. Like a first implementation was too complicated. I abandoned that. So there are some really dumb strategies which will reduce the time complexity considerably, but have a very high constant, which will still be much faster than what we have right now, because it's the time complexity that's really killing us at the moment. So if nothing else, that can be done, right? But yeah, so I would like to see if I can do something a little bit better, but the goal is here to get something relatively sooner than later. So it might be at a high constant overhead, which still should be a lot better. Yeah, that's it for the new evaluator.
Daniel, do you want to talk a bit about issue guarding?
Yeah, so we talked about issue guarding at the last call, and it was essentially because we have 600 plus issues, and many of them are correctly milestoned and labeled and so on, but some of them are not, and some of them might have been fixed in the meantime. So we started a push with this Z-Garden label to sort of go through all the issues again and make sure that they're all still valid and they're probably properly milestoned and so on. So this is still in progress. Like we said, it would be like a sort of gradual process, and we're about halfway through, nearly halfway through, but it's still ongoing. So if anybody sees that label, FYI, that's why it's there. And if anybody wants to jump in and help, please feel free. It's essentially the ones that I found that are the lowest hanging fruit is very old issues, like say 2 or 3 years plus. And we're not even 100% sure whether they're still valid. They might have been fixed, or maybe they weren't filed properly, and maybe it's just the user, holding something not exactly the right way. And that's it for issue gardening.
Just one point, for those people who have raised issues, whether they be for 0.6 or otherwise, especially issues around order of evaluation, causing changes in behavior of queue. Thank you so much for digging into those sorts of things. They're absolutely critical issues that do need to be addressed. So really, thank you for reporting them in the first place. With those issues, and indeed all the ones that we're talking about here, that all the open issues, as many issues as there are there, with the changes that are being made in the evaluator for 0.7 as well, as best as possible, it's going to solve, quotes, all of those issues from like a correctness perspective. And where there are things that are actually ambiguous as to that, they're the issues where we will actually need to focus our time. So on things like order of evaluation being problematic, those should just not be issues at all. And so that's another one of the things that we're aiming to do with the new evaluators. It's not like we're ignoring the issues. Effectively, they're being covered as part of the work in 0.7. So there's not necessarily commits against each of those issues. It might be that a whole swathe of issues just get closed with one commit saying all of these now fixed with new evaluator X coming in. So it's more that we'll have sort of very lumpy progress with a lot of these issues, and hence there will be very lumpy updates in terms of the number of outstanding open issues there are. rather than trying to close down all the issues and say, oh, this is a duplicate of this one. In a lot of situations, we actually just leave them open, and then it's much easier to go backwards and say, yep, all of these are solved now. So, okay, Daniel, I think you're talking about Unity, so over to you.
Yeah, and just to add something small to what Paul said, also thank you to those who use TestScript to file issues, because having a very easy way to reproduce a bug, it's invaluable when we go back and then need to recheck these things, because otherwise it's a bit of a manual process. So for Unity, as a reminder, it's a bit of an extension to our CI system, and because we have our own Go tests and Q tests, but Unity, it's essentially a corpus of projects that we can use as integration tests, right? So we can check if, for example, a change to the Q evaluator by Marcel is going to break any of the projects in the corpus, given some way to test them, such as Go test or Q eval or something like that. And if you want to ensure that you don't get unexpectedly broken by upcoming changes, especially 0.7 and 0.8, you should add your project to Unity if you can. So the work I've been doing in Unity is essentially developing a new CI system, because the current one is based on GitHub Actions and it has some disadvantages to the way it works. But it's mainly about flexibility and better testing. And I'll give a couple of examples to give you an idea of what I mean by that. One of them is being able to get more than a Boolean pass or fail. So for example, once we have two closeness algorithms, you might want to run the tests with both the old and the new algorithm. And then if only one of those fails, that is very valuable information, right? That's not something we can do right now. And in terms of better CI testing, it's also things like comparing multiple versions at once. So right now you just compare against like a static expected output, whereas a better CI system would be, oh, the output changed with the CL versus the parent, but it didn't change versus the latest table, for example. So that kind of more detail is going to be very useful for CI. The corpus of projects also grew slightly over summer from 11 to 15. And if you want to add your project, and as a reminder, we support both public and private projects on GitHub right now. The first step is to install the GitHub app, which you can see there. And then you should get in touch with me. And the reason for that is because the testing is not completely automatic. The second step is for you to tell me, or rather for us to agree on the method for testing your project. Some projects, it might be Q command, some others might be Q export, expecting a specific output, some others might be Go test, and some others might need, extra dependencies to be present or something like that. So if you can get in touch with me, then we can get it set up. Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
So does that mean, like, I use the Go API for Q extensively, and historically you haven't really supported like that version of the interaction with Q and testing in Unity or containers kind of things? Is that something is that possible?
Yeah, so Go test is possible. It is supported already. What we essentially do is, instead of running a particular Q binary version, what we do is we go mod replace a specific the same version. So it works in a similar way. It's only slightly trickier because Go tests tend to be a different beast compared to Q export or Q eval, because Go tests might run arbitrary code. They might take tens of minutes. They might need extra dependencies like databases. So I think it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, where I'm going to look at each project and see how their tests run and whether it's something reasonable that we can run, right? But yes.
I was going to say, like, I have Go install plus test script.
Then it should be pretty easy.
All right, well, I'll reach out then in that case.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Tony. And also just to flag that so many of the bugs that we catch are actually via Unity. There's two projects in particular that come to mind that have been in Unity now for 2+ years. And they have caught so many issues along the way. So expanding this corpus is a really good way of helping us help the community by improving the quality of these releases. So thanks for those who have submitted their projects there. Rog, do you want to talk about modules?
Yep, sure. Just to give an overview, modules are when we're planning to allow the ability to provide your Q modules in a network downloadable way, so others can use them. There's a proposal, issue 2230, where we propose this is the second module, such module proposal, and we've had various feedback sessions, which have been really helpful actually for helping us understand some of the priorities and some of the features that people need for modules, and we're planning to continue those. So every other Thursday. So it would be great if we could see you along at those. Next slide, please. So yeah, in those feedback sessions, we've had some good discussions, and one of the cases I'll call out in particular is the public-private split, because initially we were focusing on just a single registry, central registry that everyone uses, but actually I think it's pretty clear that from at least very early stage, maybe not the very first stage, but very early stage, we'll support the ability to get some modules from the public queue registry, from the central registry, and others from some private registry of your own. And just to be clear, what we're talking, when we say registry here, we're actually talking about a standard OCI registry as deployed in many clouds, probably all clouds these days. So you'll be able to, if you want your queue command only to talk to your particular region, then you'll be able to copy modules to your own registry, like essentially to mirror modules from the central registry to your own registry, and use them and point your queue to that, and you'll be able to download those. But we will support also the ability, clearly, if you're not publishing to the central registry, you need the ability to publish your own modules to your own registry. So we'll provide the capability to do that. So the flow between different registries, you'll be able to use standard OCI registry commands, such as Scopio, for example, various others, to copy modules between different registries, but there will also in time be support for the queue command for doing that, for actually mirroring. So that's we'll also support like standard authentication as supported by those tools, which actually is defined pretty much by the Docker command, because that's the de facto standard for authentication. So you'll be able to have a configuration file that specifies how authentication should occur to different registries, and so when you run the queue command, it will automatically use that, just like any other inhabitant of the OCI ecosystem. Next slide, please. So as far as what we're doing next, so I developed a sort of proof of concept fairly rapidly, but that's currently, it has a bunch of commits on my local machine. So I'm making that into a set of stack of CLs, which are going to start landing very soon. And we want to continue to interact with yourselves on the what you think, what you want out of modules, what you need out of modules, any ideas that you have, and if anyone has any thoughts, or please feel free to make some discussions and come along to the feedback calls, and interact on CLs and PRs and that sort of thing, and yeah, please come along to the feedback session.
One thing to point out, we'll continue to advertise those sessions, is that we're going to also try to do a better job of starting to document which use cases will be, quote, solved when. so that everybody is clear how we're phasing these things. So if somebody says, oh, I'm trying to do X, Y, Z here, we should be able to point to a specific use case and say, that's an instance of that use case there. We are planning on that to land here. Can you confirm that use case covers your situation there? And so that way we just are clear really that we are covering off all angles, and we can point to effectively definitive, I don't know how we're necessarily going to document these, but documentation somewhere so that we have a catalog of use cases that we're just ticking off as we go along the way, implementing things.
Yeah.
So please help give feedback on those as we start to share those as well. Aram is away today, so I'll give a quick update here on the WebAssembly side of things with the assistance of Marcel, who will hopefully come in and correct me where I go wrong on things. Just a quick reminder about why we're doing the WebAssembly piece. Q at the moment is just something that allows us to interact with via the Go API and the Go standard library built-in standard library, if I can say that the right way around. WASM, however, offers us a bridge to already existing ecosystems of code, especially in other languages beyond Go, as well as helping to broaden the built-ins that people use if we also leverage the module ecosystem as well. So the idea here being that not everything can be expressed in pure Q, and we should be able to make it extensible such that people can access things in other general purpose languages like Go, Rust, whatever they might be. Aram's working on this. We already have support for the WASM modules using the C ABI, which landed in version 0.6.0. And it was previously announced that that was present in the alpha. That's now launched in version 0.6.0. We had a WebAssembly focus call where we helped to dive into, and that recording is linked there from 2463, where we talked in a bit more detail about all these various interactions and what the work ahead is here. Work on the correctness detector has, as I understand it, been paused, and instead we've actually jumped straight into the support for richer data types. And Marcel, I don't know whether you wanted to talk a bit about that or indeed anything else here.
Yeah, so it's still a comment on the previous slide. So
pardon me.
Yeah, one thing there is, of course, what's quite important is that what we've seen with configuration languages is that usually they because people do need to do computation in them, that over time they become so complex that you might as well program in a regular language. So we think it's very healthy for configuration language or for configuration and code to be separated strictly. Even if there is a coupling between it, and this is also part of the motivation of WebAssembly, the original motivation. That's quite an important principle. So think of it as a spreadsheet where generally most of what you do in a spreadsheet should be easy, and if you have something complicated, just maintain it somewhere else, which is optimized for managing code. Yep.
Tony,
how does the scripting layer fit into that statement that code and config should be separate? I'm just
how does what? Sorry, how does the
scripting layer relate to that statement? Because it is like
so the scripting layer,
also known as the tooling layer for
also
other
known as the
folks.
tooling layer, yeah. So yeah, it is a bit the same idea. So the original idea was actually for the tooling layer to fill that role, but it's a bit clunky for certain cases. So that's where the WebAssembly will just fits this more nicely. But essentially, the WebAssembly, you could see it as a part of the tooling layer in some way, because you can basically, you could evaluate Q saying, okay, don't provide any concrete implementations for these WebAssembly hooks, right? And then it's like you will see an unevaluated function call certain places, right? So it would just be incomplete. So this is very similar to what you would have in the tooling layer. So conceptually, it's split sort of in the same way, but the tooling layer is more like a interpretation on top of Q that with some semantics that allows you to shell things out to other computations and put it back in. But the WebAssembly in some way is a more principled way of doing that. But yeah, they're complementary, but aiming sort of to do the same thing. Roger?
I might mention that at least as I see it, the tooling layer could be considered a kind of stopgap until because once you've got first-class functions, then you can potentially implement the tooling layer using those. When so we have WASM as one implementation of those, but also you could see functions as being a kind of gateway through to the outside world, which currently the tooling layer does by convention, but maybe this is a little bit speculative, but maybe the functions could also fulfill that role. So that's much more explicit regarding where the flows are. The external flows are.
Kevin, I'll just come to you in 1 second. The one point just to emphasize, though, is the hermeticity, if I've got that word correctly, of queue evaluation, however, will not be violated in all of this. And that's where the WebAssembly piece comes in terms of the sandboxing of WebAssembly. So where you have a queue evaluation that you want to be hermetic, and that will be the default, ostensibly, of the queue evaluator, it will be such. And actually, the guarantees we get from the WebAssembly sandboxing will help enforce that. The reproducibility aspect coming from the reproducibility that we get via a strong modules ecosystem as well, with effectively the equivalent of the SumDB or equivalent thereof from the Go world in the Q ecosystem. So for those for whom that is important, that reproducibility, hermeticity, that is not violated per se by the WebAssembly piece, just as you can escape that with the tooling layer today. The idea would be the same as well with the WebAssembly piece as to where you want to let the handbrake off effectively and extend to the outside world. Just to flag that. Kevin, please.
Sure. Just to add another level of complexity are the queue template functions. So the template map that's passed into the templates. So I don't know if that's possible. It's just another consideration that if we could use those WASM functions or something in there, that would also be excellent.
I'm not sorry, Kevin. You're a tiny bit quiet, and I'm not sure I fully understood the point. If you could just try again.
Sorry, the queue templates, like the function map into the templates.
Right, text template. Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Correct. I'm just adding a third level of, function usage.
That's a very interesting point as far as sort of extending that with via WebAssembly is concerned.
As a possibility or a consideration, at least.
That's a very interesting point. I'm not aware, Marcel, that we've necessarily thought about how that would fit in, but
I'm not sure if I understand the use case.
So within text template, there's a standard set of functions that exist as part of text template when you're doing certain things. And Kevin's keenly pointing out there, I think it's a good observation. It's sort of come up in various discussions and issues in the past that can also be extended in a very straightforward way, at least conceptually, because they're very simple functions in terms of what they're consuming and what they're spitting out. So yeah, Kevin, let's add that to our notes from today to make sure that we capture that. It might be that we need to slightly rethink how that templating works, because at the moment we're using, or at least how we bootstrap it, for want of a better phrase, but let's not try and jump into the detail too much of that now. But thank you very much for bringing it up. It was a great... who else? Tony, thank you.
I was going to ask if you're talking about the WebAssembly and all that, and if there's a world where the DAG solver and the thing that sort of orders like computation in the tooling layer, like, is there a world where that actually ends up in a core evaluator?
Which DAG solver?
The one in Qflow. The sort of like the way it solves like what tasks need to run before others because of checking on like incompleteness and such things.
Yeah. So what Roger's point is that basically, so this is still a hypothesis, if you will, but the idea is that basically these function. So this would, if you really want to do the WebAssembly thing properly, which we intend to do, that we have a function signature type, basically, so that we can actually express what is the API of these WebAssembly functions, right? So if you have that, and it actually is useful for very many applications. So we've been toying with this idea for a long time. So if you have that type, you basically, and you specify that, you can actually use that to explicitly specify what are the data flows within your configuration, right? So, so through that mechanism, potentially, yes, it would become a language feature, but it would be strictly separated. So you would probably, I mean, one way you could think about it, this is one idea that Roger had, that you have the Q evaluator and you pass it a sort of a callback or whatever it was, right? Or iterator. It's like, okay, I have now this function stop that needs to be satisfied, and then you have a separate piece of code that then does that for you, and then, you know, the Q evaluator would figure out, okay, which one do I need to do next? Which one do I need to do next? And so yeah. So long story short, in that direction, yes, possibly.
It's like Qflow is awesome. I love that whole DAG solving engine in there
Yeah.
and whatnot.
And so I think
Very
that's
useful.
it. Just to pick up on Qflow, because there's been an interesting amount of discussion since the last community call about the tools flow and Q command and what's going on in that space as well. So to just briefly touch on that in this context, right? There's a lot of update that we've just covered there that touches on tools flow and Q command. And Q command is an area where we know there are a number of rough edges of how people actually use it. But perhaps it's sort of becoming a bit clearer now why we actually need to address sort of like this function piece, the WASM piece, etc. first, before trying to reimagine too much what Q command v2 will look like, because these are like fundamental building blocks of how this stuff could turn out in the future. So rather than try and play with everything at once, keep all these balls juggling in the air, instead this foundational focus on the WASM piece, which kind of, Tony, to your point, is the WASM implementation of, oh, let me handle all these function calls with WASM code, is just one implementation of how those function calls could be satisfied. They could, as Roger was suggesting, actually ultimately be satisfied by anything. And the Q evaluator could just sort of call some handler, for want of a better phrase, as Marcel was saying, to have that satisfied. And so the Q command stuff is that layer on top of tools flow where we have some sort of principled declarative workflow. That there are plenty of rough edges, and thanks to those people who have contributed to that discussion in the meantime. It's not like we are ignoring you, far from it. It's actually that we're trying to work out how to get the building blocks right, so that rather than necessarily just totally reinventing what Q command looks like in terms of the declarative workflows, it might be that the WebAssembly piece actually just helps us reimagine it completely. So
yeah, for me, it's like WebAssembly seems more just like a different like task that you could run in the larger Qflow. And I'll say, like, I've built a custom custom Hoff flow on top of Qflow with different. I have a lot of thoughts around some of those edges, for sure.
Cool.
Yes, so the function signature, extension would be independent or orthogonal to WASM. Of course, it's WASM.
Yeah.
Could use
Right.
it.
Yeah. That'd be cool
Yet
too.
another use case where it would be really handy to have it. I mean,
Oh, someone had the hand. Oh, Roger, sorry, I didn't see it. Yep.
Yeah, I just mentioned that the functions, like if functions were used as as a way to execute external code, it's strictly more general than the tools flow stuff, because the tools flow essentially relies on having like a path from the root to whatever needs to be evaluated. So you can never have like a function of a function sort of thing. Whereas with function signatures, you can have an expression that has several of these things in. And also I'll sort of toss out there that there's this idea that, when you have like more general computations, that you might have some idea of like capabilities that you can pass down. So you'd essentially explicitly pass down the capability to execute these functions, which I think is a more principled approach to what things can be executed than is going on in tools flow at the moment, which is essentially an arbitrary exploration of the tree and evaluation of things in some particular places which aren't necessarily clear to the user.
Somebody else? Tony?
Yeah,
Yep.
if I could just plug one more idea as you're thinking there, Roger, of like that computation and like the between it happening on different machines. That's all. Like if we could distribute that across
One of the beauties of Q is the potential to distribute across machines in an arbitrary way
Yeah.
and combine the results in a
Yeah.
in arbitrary order, and that's one of the potential, future looking absolute, yes, you can distribute all of this stuff, but
Yeah.
we're not quite there yet.
Just as a reminder, like somebody early in the community pointed out that Q is essentially a propagator network, which was like this computation model invented by MIT in the 70s, which basically says this is, the optimal model for parallel computation and stuff like that. So it's quite intriguing.
Daniel's kindly reminded us that we have actually got some more of our the update slides to get through. But
Right. So let me finish this slide also. Yeah, the richer
great.
data types. Yeah. So right now it's just the C ABI, which is not very useful. So the idea is to support richer. So basically any JSON value, if you will, in the WASM calls as an argument to the function. So that would be much more useful. But it's a bit tricky because WASM doesn't really support it at all. There's some emerging standards, but they're not really, doesn't seem like a good idea to wait on it. They're also very complicated. So we're doing this sort of trial with, rolling around. So
Will there be
around,
strings?
pardon?
Strings weren't in the first one. Will we have those? I mean, I could just serialize the JSON.
Yeah, so I don't know if the C ABI supports strings at the moment. Of course, then you would be able to do a lot more, but apparently it's whether you do an arbitrary structure or strings doesn't matter that much for exactly the reason you mentioned.
So
yeah.
the richer data types will, as Marcel said, just support the equivalent of JSON encoding.
Yeah.
In terms of what's so, I think Aram, Aram will be able to provide more of an update, a more precise update on this next time. So we'll advertise when the next community call is, and Aram can talk more in detail about that. Alpha.qlang.org. This we talked about last time was actually how we're going to get alpha.qlang.org live, with the focus being on ramping up our content creation and restarting the docs and content calls, as well as getting our content creation pipeline working smoothly. We're running around 3 to 4 weeks behind where we'd like to be on that. The front end is done for now. It's not like it's done for forever, but we've got as good a first cut as we actually need for getting this stuff live, including reimagined parts of the playground, which will include examples. And all of the basis for either how-tos, tutorials, or the language guide as part of this core Q documentation. The initial content is just being finessed, and that's where we're slightly behind on the content side of things. And I'll personally excuse some of that down to the aforementioned illness that we had. But we'll be sharing previews for feedback and discussion via GitHub discussions. And as always, we've been gathering content and ideas and questions that we should be covering via Slack. The summer has been, I keep referring to it as the summer, just ignoring the Southern Hemisphere entirely. I'll stop that right now. The Northern Hemisphere summer has been fantastic for folks with exchanges on Slack. We've had some really, really good exchanges on Slack. And with the focus on qlang.org and thinking about how we can answer these questions best for folks as well, it's just provided like a font of ideas for what we should be covering in terms of core Q documentation on qlang.org. So thanks to those folks who have engaged in the conversations, asking questions in the first place, but also interacting on Slack. There've been some really good exchanges. So thank you for those. The goal really being to, in the next 3 to 4 weeks, get these bits of content out there and then start turning this handle on that content creation cycle of somebody asked a question. We should be able to just point them to about Q itself. We should be able to point them to somewhere on alpha.qlang.org and say, here is the answer to your question in either short form, in like a how-to, or in longer form, more like a tutorial, sort of guiding them. Or in the language guide, if they're looking for something that is more sort of pure in its explanation of what Q actually is. So that's the place we want to get to. And so we'll be sharing more of those updates over the coming weeks, as I said, with links to actual bits of content for folks to provide some feedback on. Moving on to sort of slightly wider community updates. Marcel, did you want to talk about the Conflang? Splash? That's
Yeah, sure. So this is, forgot the exact date. I think
end of
25th.
October, I think. It's 25th.
Yeah,
or something like
25th
that.
or 24th of October, 25th, I think. So as part of the Splash ACM conference, there is like a configuration language, so not Q specific, but configuration language workshop. And I'm giving a talk there. I'm also on the program committee there, so like I'll be quite involved and hanging around there. But it should be interesting. You know, there's some interesting talks. A lot of old Google colleagues coming there talking about the predecessor, if you will, and tooling around that. So it might be quite interesting. And the whole idea is here to so general and academics, there's not that much idea, you know, there's not that much research into configuration language. It's starting to come. I was at this sort of gathering a little while ago where you see there is actually really interesting and industry relevant research into configuration related technology that will be really useful for Q to use. So we want to, you know, be sort of dialed in there and stay in touch.
Great,
So-
thank you. The link there will take you through to anyone who's actually wanting to attend in person. I'm not sure whether they do any virtual stuff. I can't remember that off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Tony's been getting quite excited about something he's been working on recently, which has sort of reminded me that we really do need to do separate sessions where folks can advertise a bit about what they've been working on Q related. And so we'll do a separate live stream because, again, it would be really impossible and not really fair to Tony or indeed anyone else looking to demo these things, as we found in the past, to try and squeeze it into the hour that we have now. So we will do such a live stream, Tony, if you're still keen on that, and then just share the link via Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it, and all the usual channels. On alpha.qlang.org, if there's we're speaking to a number of different projects, companies who actually are interested in having their logo displayed on what will be qlang.org when it's actually gone live. So please let Dominic know if you want to have your logo displayed as well. And we're also going to work out how we can then start to go the level beyond just showing the logo itself to giving like a short form description of what the use case is of Q in that situation, and then looking to extend that to longer form case studies at some point as well. One thing that did happen just after the last community call was Jonathan and I ran a Q plus Terraform live stream where we explored work that we'd been doing in the Q and Terraform space, which, given the fairly recent news of changes on the Terraform side of things, it was quite interesting, especially that this was really well received. Thanks to those who joined, but also asked questions on the call and afterwards as well. There's plenty more, I think, to explore in this space. So for those folks who are interested, I think there's been a number of long discussions on Slack where folks have followed up in terms of what it means to use Q in the Terraform space. So please keep those discussions happening. And if there's anything else that we can sort of share by means of like show and tell, please do that via the GitHub discussions show and tell. Someone's got the hand up, Tony.
Yeah, I just have one more thing that there's the channel on Slack, and we're thinking about getting together for like a Terraform specific call.
Thank you for the reminder.
So,
yeah, I had seen
if you're
that.
interested in that, definitely get in the channel. I think I might be heading up trying to organize that myself. Just
Wonderful.
to, like, get the ball rolling on getting that call together.
Super, thank you. What else have we got? Yes, quick reminder on the Q modules proposal feedback sessions every other Thursday. So the 14th, Rog, thanks for getting that one in the calendar. Docs and content calls. We'll start to share some bits of content via Slack first to just get the ball rolling so that we actually have a few pieces of content to talk through. And so then once we're up and running on that, we will just have those every fortnight as well for folks to give feedback on content that's coming out via alpha.qlang.org. We pretty much covered this. If you're working on anything interesting Q related, let us know. Plenty of ways of actually doing that. Next community call, we'll confirm the date for. As ever, if we have any feedback for us on how things are running project-wise, things you'd like to see more or less of, or at different areas of focus, please let us know. Otherwise, Q&A, although we've had some fairly hefty Q&A already, which is appreciated. I'll be quiet now, and for anyone who hasn't managed to raise their hand yet, please do. Maybe we already covered it. Jan. Oh, Jan, you're just on mute at the moment.
I just started to look into Q. Fascinating language, but I'm still experimenting. Had a couple of questions on Slack, and like my question actually changed in the course of this meeting because I had the playground open and something apparently seems to work. So from the examples, I was under the impression that all these examples of let or if things don't really work like expressions. So you can have just like conditional struct entries, multiple struct keys depending on if. But I now just realized that if I just open a parenthesis, so just open a block that looks like a struct and use some lets in there and just end up in an expression, I can actually also assign primitive values. Right, so I could have a C and then that's either string or int, and it depends on complex if and let and whatnot logic. I just wanted to ask if that is on purpose and is as it is, then maybe just the documentation should change, or if that's more a glitch of the language and it shouldn't even work that way. Because the examples all go for, yeah, you can conditionally add keys to a structure.
Yeah, I think part of why that is that when the documentation was written, and then since we started writing a language guide sort of from scratch, but that's not out yet. So that possibility wasn't there yet. But then we realized for many reasons, a lot of people find it quite useful to allow a scalar within a struct, basically, along with definitions. So you're not allowed to have a regular field next to a normal field, but you can have definitions. So that's where that came from, and that's why you can have that in a struct, and that's also what allows you to have a comprehension that just produces a value and not just fields, basically.
Yeah, it's basically, it is not a struct in this case. So my original question would have been, why are let and conditionals not expressions, right? That just can be used wherever you can use expressions.
Yep.
I think they are not, but this comes very close to what I was looking for.
Yeah. The curly braces.
I'm not sure if it's fully there. I just started to explore it, so I might still raise the question of if we could have them formally as expressions, where, like, I don't know what the last sub-expression is going to be the result of something, but it looks like at least getting very close to what I was looking for.
Yeah, and I've just actually linked to an example which I think is the kind of thing that you were talking about there, and it's an example of the embedded scalars that Marcel is effectively referring to as well, of how then, is that the kind of thing that you're referring to there, where the if comprehension is resulting in the value 1 in that situation? That being...
this is switch pattern. If I see it correctly, I've got.
I mean, I just happen to be using a switch pattern here as a demonstration of how the embedded scalar concept is actually working there. If there is a specific example where you think,
no, I just have a play example like that one, but it's really just about like I might have some more complicated logic to decide what kind of values I want, and I want to hide certain things, right? And I was under the impression that if my result is not a struct, then I don't have any chance to put the kind of the scope of whatever intermediate values I need in the outside scope of my calculation, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But that was the main point, without a concrete use case, without a too concrete use case. But it was about auxiliary values that leaked scope somehow. That was my primary case to look into.
No, this is completely valid.
Yeah,
great.
And that's also an instance of the one that you've shared is an example of embedding of scalars as well. So yeah, totally expected. But the question I was going to ask is, if you came to this from like a specific question or use case or something where it wasn't clear to you that this was valid or not, that's the kind of thing we're also looking to capture in the new documentation as well, is that we are going to repeat ourselves in lots of different ways in the new documentation, and that's a very good thing. So talking about embedded scalars, we're not just going to have one part of the documentation that talks about embedded scalars. Is we should have the answer being embedded scalars to, I don't know, 20, 30 different questions, and people land on that. So if you're able to share where you were coming from with this kind of thing, that would be very, very useful, because it's those sorts of things which then will have Algolia search as part of the new QLang.org setup as well. So people should be able to find this stuff, and the richer the questions we have, the richer the tagging, etc., the more easily it will be findable as well. So thank you.
Yeah, I'll try to come up with something, and then maybe either I'll add it to a Slack thread that I already created.
That'd be great. Yep. Thank you, Tony.
Regarding embedded scalars, if I have a field that's an in, is there a reason we couldn't upgrade that to an embedded scalar through unification, like the meet operator, the ampersand? Like if I had an in and I unified it with like a struct that only had a definition with that, like I could see coming along later and adding on like validation in those definitions and be able to like check things later.
Not sure what the question.
I mean, you can have an embedded scalar when you write it. Why can't I like write it in two parts like the rest of like a Q value works that way?
Oh, you can do that. You just would unify it with another struct that has an embedded scalar as well.
No.
But I would have to define it with the embedded scalar first. I couldn't just write the curly braces in one definition field.
Well, you can, but you have to do like underscore, embed an underscore if you don't know what.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So you have to have that underscore there.
Yeah.
I think the thing we're also missing there, Marcel, but you can correct me, is the ability to alias the embedded value as well.
Well, that's sort of orthogonal, right?
Okay, then I might be holding something slightly wrong there.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that's what you were looking for, Tony, but I just added another example where I just added that C is not only defined as here's that embedding thing, but also you can have a separate mention of C that this should be an int, and you can also ampersand it like that. But maybe that's not what you were talking about.
And it eludes me for the moment, but there was a reason why you have to use this underscore. Otherwise, there's some problem with Q evaluation. It's a little bit ugly. So I think that Stephen Harris last time had some suggestion that if we have the function call notation for unifying a struct with concrete fields, you could elide the underscore. So that might be a nice way of dealing with it. But that's a separate.
The underscore only makes it in there after the first hour of fumbling around,
Yeah.
trying to remember what's wrong.
I forgot about the underscore, so that solves any problems I have for now. If there's like a better way to express it later, fine, but that's good enough.
All right, cool.
Kevin, last one, and then I think we're pretty much at time.
Oh, sure. I just wanted to call out on the other end of the tech spectrum. I think there have been 2 updates to the IntelliJ plugin for Q, including the structural outline and some syntax updates. So that's incredibly helpful, because I'm putting Q on people who are not super technical on their machines. And so the better that usability experience, which is improving, is really been nice. So thank you.
Thanks for calling that out. And we're actually speaking to, I hope I'm going to pronounce his name correctly, Joachim, about on continuing the updates, etc., for the IntelliJ plugin, because we know that gets a good audience. So thanks for calling that out, Kevin, especially for the, as to use your phrases, those less perhaps language oriented, less technically oriented. Somebody else has got their hand up. Tony.
Me again, of course. Regarding like tools and syntaxes, I was thinking about doing something for Chroma, Hugo, Pigments. It's all like the same grammar spec, just something quick and dirty to at least get us somewhere before, while we're all waiting on LSP. and other
thank you.
more like official things. I'd like to just at least get something dirty done.
Thanks for bringing that up. We should definitely do that. It is entirely orthogonal from the LSP piece. The only thing I think we can and should look at doing is, by all means, we can do something quick and dirty, and we're really happy to have any of this stuff in the QLang organization as well, because that way sort of the bits are gathered closely together. I think in the Slack thread, Tony, if I didn't, apologies for that, I should have done, is point out the tree sitter implementation that already exists for Q.
I use that.
The one thing
Shiki already has a like Q syntax highlighting, but it uses there's two main engines that people use and write grammars for, and they're different syntaxes.
Sure.
And formats. So we need the other one.
The one thing I was thinking is that with all of this, if let's just imagine, I'm going to pluck a figure out of thin air here, that let's say there are 10 quotes grammars we need to maintain here. That's quite painful. And the IntelliJ plugin, thank you for mentioning it, Kevin, also maintains its idea of what the grammar of Q is as well. So this starts to get a bit silly at some stage where we're having to make all these changes across the board. So the one thing that we might want to think about as we're doing this is, can we actually use one of them as the source of truth and generate the others from it? Now, that might be sort of like a pipe dream, which is a bit further down the line. So Tony, not at all to put a spanner in the works of getting something quick and dirty done. And I think you'd get plenty of people helping out with maintaining something quick and dirty in the short term. But just an idea that we already have, Eon Patabon has said we can migrate the tree sitter implementation into the QLang organization. We should do that along with the other grammars, just so that it's nicely consolidated and we have a single sort of organization, at least, for maintaining these under one banner at least.
Yeah, as far as the tools that take like source code and turn it into like colored HTML and whatnot and other formats, but there's really only two primary grammars that I've seen out there in the majority of the tools. So we have one already.
Yep.
And we just need the other main one, which gets us Hugo, which I know a lot of people around here use.
And we'll definitely use that as part of Alpha.
And I'm using Chroma like directly, so that would be and help me there.
Did I see another hand? No, I didn't see another hand.
David asked a
It was
question
just
in
me
chat.
about tree sitter, but you covered it.
Oh, okay. And David will ask one. We are slightly at time, and for being respectful of the fact that others have places to go. David, can we follow up on that one, as Daniel suggested, offline? Really happy to do that, or as Roger did.
Yeah, thank you. No problems.
Sorry for not getting to it. Thanks everyone for joining today. Great discussion. And look forward to catching up on the next community call, where, as I said, Aram will actually be able to fill in all the blanks that I created on the WebAssembly side of things. And so please come armed with ideas, questions, thoughts, updates for next time as well. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Cheers out.